That, of course, was Premier Jim Prentice, the Alberta Premier. And we start tonight in battleground Alberta with the loose ends from the election of Prentice as leader of Alberta's Progressive Conservatives and Premier of the province have meant a series of by-elections must be held, as you heard, by November the 17th. Prentice himself has no seat. He's only ever held federal office, of course, and the ministers in Prentice's cabinet with what are arguably the two biggest portfolios also do not have seats. And since Prentice has vowed that all three will have seats when the legislature resumes sitting, that means there has to be 3 by-elections pretty quick. Now, we still don't know where Prentice is going to run. A lot of rumors, but we do know where Health Minister Stephen Mandel and Education Minister Gordon Dirks are going to run. Mandel will be in Edmonton-Whitemud. That's the seat that became vacant when interim Premier Dave Hancock resigned. Dirks, though, is going to run in the riding that used to be represented by Alison Redford. That riding, of course, Calgary Elbow. And folks, I'm here to tell you that does not look like it's going to be a walk in the park for Dirks. Wild Rose leader Danielle Smith vowing to put up a heck of a fight there. And there's another wild card. The leader of the Alberta Party, Greg Clark, is running there. And folks, one of those working on Greg Clark's campaign is a guy named Stephen Carter. He helped get Naheed Nenshi elected mayor of Calgary, helped Redford win the leader's job, and helped Redford become the premier of the province. And Stephen Carter is in our Calgary studio now. Stephen, great to have you on board. And am I right? Here I am in Ottawa trying to pick up the winds of whatever's happening in Calgary. The Calgary Elbow is going to be, it's going to be a fight. It's not going to be a walk in the park for Dirks.
Well, as you can imagine, sitting out here in Calgary, I'm quite surprised that someone in Ottawa got something right about Calgary. I know that Minister Jason Kenney couldn't be more wrong with his temporary foreign workers, but I'll leave that for another battleground, another day. Yes, Calgary Elbow is going to be quite the contest. We are going to see, I think, a 4-way race for that seat, in which any party could win. And putting Gordon Dirks into Calgary Elbow, this is a man who has represented the school board in Calgary before, but has represented the suburbs in Northwest Calgary. And I'll tell you, the suburbs in Northwest Calgary have virtually nothing to do with Calgary Elbow.
One of the things that does also strike a guy from Ottawa is downtown Calgary is not necessarily the rest of the province, obviously. It has a chance of voting Liberal federally, and certainly there are provincial Liberals representing some downtown Calgary ridings. So can I assume then Calgary Elbow is a little more on the progressive side than the conservative side generally? Where do you sort of place it in terms of voters and their ambitions?
Well, I think that they are very much on the progressive side. I mean, right now, Kent Hare has a Liberal MLA, is right adjacent to Calgary Elbow. Calgary Elbow was represented by a Liberal in a by-election from 2007 through 2008 until Alison Redford took it over. Mm-hmm. And I seem to recall the Sun News Network seemed to think that Redford was pretty much progressive, not necessarily a red progressive.
Yes,
not a conservative conservative. So right now, I would say that putting Gordon Dirks in there, an evangelical minister who has taken stands against homosexuality in his work in the past, is not going to be received very well. I mean, this is also a guy who closed, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 different schools in the inner city when he was a school board trustee, so he could open more schools in the suburbs, which is exactly the plan that Prentice floated late last week.
All right, so as you looked around at the state of politics in your particular province and said, I wouldn't mind getting in the mix here, and you chose the Alberta Party. What is an Alberta Party, and give us the thumbnail why the other existing parties, you didn't see any options with a Liberal and a Democrat, or the PCs, or obviously the Wild Rose. Why do we need an Alberta Party?
Because Alberta's the place where we sometimes choose none of the above. I think you may have found the Reform Party formed here was one of those parties that said, you know what, none of the above is the better option for us. And we're going to choose that party instead of trying to stick with these old parties that have broken traditions, broken habits, and broken entitlements. And that's exactly what the PCs, the Wild Rose, and the Liberal Party represent. And I can assure you, there is no new Democratic Party in Calgary, Alberta.
We're going to have Rachel Notley on a little later on in the show. I'm going to ask her
how she's doing down there.
I'm going to ask her the same question. All right. We had Elizabeth May on the program last night. Elizabeth May was saying, she had the success in New Brunswick election, or sorry, Greens had success in New Brunswick.
Yeah,
they've had
she'll take credit for it.
Right, yeah. She'll take credit, why not? And they've had success in Victoria. And she says because it's a none of the above vote that's coming out to vote. People who are not voting are showing up, and you can argue with that premise, but let me ask you then with the Alberta Party, are you aiming at those who, say, have not voted in the last couple of elections because they've been so annoyed with the options on the table, or is there some parties that you can see, yes, we're going to take a little bit of PC here, a little bit of Liberal here, and Bob's your uncle?
Well, I think that the objective of any political consultant should be trying to get people who didn't vote last time to vote this time.
Sure.
That's what we did with Naheed Nenshi's race. That's what we did with Alison Redford's leadership. We brought people out who hadn't voted before, who felt like none of the options represented them. And they saw in Naheed Nenshi and they saw in Alison Redford the policies and the ideas and the types of personalities that they wanted. Naheed's continued to be, I think, a very good mayor here in Calgary, and Alison Redford was less so. So what we have is the opportunity to choose again and to try and get it right this time.
The last time I was covering an election that you were involved in was the 2012 provincial election, and I was on the campaign buses in Alberta, and it was my first time doing that, and what really struck me was the power of the PC brand. So much so, there were people who I would want to quote by name and who might be thinking Wild Rose, but they were scared that if the PC party won, something bad would happen to them. You've heard these sorts of stories.
Yeah.
And you're going up against this brand, and my suspicion is Calgary Elbow voters probably like the idea that a premier was once coming from there, and now a very powerful education minister they could have as a representative. Is that going to be an issue to overcome this brand that, to a degree, you were very successful in leveraging in 2012?
You're making, I think, first of all, what you're describing is not a progressive conservative brand. What you're describing is a government that tries to bully its citizens to fall in line. You are describing a totalitarian regime, not a brand. So let's be clear about that. And yes, the PCs have been known to use their totalitarian regime to try and bring others into line all the time. I've been a victim of it. I've seen it happen time and time again. I tried to make sure that it didn't happen, and here we are. I know that there are threats that have been levied against people who are working on our campaign right now. There's been threats levied against me to fall back into line, fall back with the PCs. Pat Walsh was going to run in Calgary Elbow for the Progressive Conservative Party. He was told, fall back in line, get out of the way. And he stood with Danielle Smith and her candidate from the Wild Rose when they announced their candidacy yesterday. That tells me all you need to know about the PC party and its totalitarian regime.
And yet, we can all agree with that diagnosis. Now, how do you beat that regime, which, as we know, is the most successful, quote, totalitarian regime in, Western democratic history? It's won since '71 with this kind of approach.
You don't have to defeat them. They're defeating themselves. Jim Prentice has made move after move that strikes of hypocrisy. His announcement yesterday about his Accountability Act, that's a rerun. There's great columns in Alberta, some in the Calgary Sun right here today, talking about how essentially these are the exact same words coming from the fourth consecutive progressive conservative premier. People aren't believing it anymore. And they're willing to walk away from the PC brand because the PC brand continues to let them down in healthcare, education, social services, and post-secondary education. That's what people want to talk about. The Wild Rose thinks that they have a solution. They think that people want to hear. I disagree with that point of view. I'm working from the Alberta Party side.
Sorry, last quick one, Stephen, is the Wild Rose Party, too, you could also characterize as a none-of-the-above party. That's where its roots were, and it's, what, about a decade old or something like that now? And it may be on the cusp, who knows, of taking power. For the Alberta Party, could it be do you see this building to the kind of thing where it's a government, ready to be a governing party? I assume not next election, but the election after that?
You know your Alberta politics. We tend to shift very, very quickly from one side to the other. I'm thinking that we'll see something more like Naheed Nenshi and less like a slow rise of a political power.
Well, okay, well, let's keep chatting about this, because that's one of the reasons I find Alberta politics fascinating, is because don't like it, let's change things, except when it comes to provincial government. Stephen Carter works at Hill & Knowlton. He's a political strategist helping out the Greg Clark campaign for the Alberta Party. Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
All right. Meanwhile, a junior minister in Prentice's cabinet told a conference of municipal politicians that Prentice was looking, quote, very, very closely, end quote, at a sales tax. Alberta, God bless them, has no sales tax. Prentice then had to scramble to put out the fires, saying, no, we're not doing a sales tax, not planning one, not in the foreseeable future. Prentice trying to put that toothpaste back in the tube. Jeff Wilson is the Wild Rose MLA for Calgary Shaw. He's up at the legislature in Edmonton. And Jeff, when you saw this earlier today, that, oh my gosh, one of Cabinet Prentice's ministers is openly not backing away when he's saying, are you sure about that? Talking about sales tax, and then Prentice having to come out and do things. This is probably going to be good fodder in a by-election, would it not be?
Well, it's literally just more of the same from this PC government. When Alison Redford was the premier, there were case after case of her ministers saying one thing and the premier turning around and saying something entirely different. And what happened today was exactly that. We have a junior minister in David Dorward musing about revenue streams and sales taxes and saying that Jim Prentice will, quote, look very, very closely at them. Well, no more than an hour later, we have Jim Prentice saying that is certainly not the case. So I think Albertans have had enough of this, and literally what we see today is just more of the same.
And I guess you sort of touched on a good point. I want to sort of draw you out a bit on it in the sense that there was a member of the PC cabinet talking about a revenue problem, and sales tax or not, oh my gosh, we don't have enough money coming in from the taxpayer. I'm assuming Wild Rose would take a different view that, no, you have a spending problem and something needs to be done about that.
Precisely, you've nailed it. We do have a spending problem here in Alberta. We've had one for the last number of years. It started really around the tenure of Ed Stelmach, where as if the province had just maintained a status quo of spending and increased that based on population and inflation, we would still be running surpluses in Alberta, but unfortunately we're now 7 straight deficits in this province, and it has everything to do with a spending problem, not a revenue problem.
Now, I want to touch on the by-elections. Edmonton White Mud is where there's going to be one. Calgary Shaw is where there's or sorry, not your riding. Calgary Elbow is where there's going to be one. But you're nearby anyways. Yeah. So give me your sense. We just were talking to Stephen Carter, and God bless him and his optimism about this new Alberta party. But my bet is it's going to be Wild Rose or PC in both those ridings. What's your expectation for the way this is going to unfold?
Well, I believe that Albertans are ready to send the PCs a message, and particularly in Calgary Elbow, we are going to be fighting for every single vote. In Edmonton White Mud, we are going to be fighting for every single vote, and wherever it is that Jim Prentice ultimately decides to run. Make no mistake that we have a very strong candidate in Calgary Elbow in Colonel John Fletcher. We are very confident how he's going to match up against an unelected minister in Gordon Dirks. Mm-hmm. And we're hearing that, on the ground, a lot of positive. We're not hearing a lot of people who are telling us at the doors that they're just can't wait to get out and cast another ballot for the PC Party of Alberta.
Well, I guess that. What you think the ballot question will be? Just on the whole entitlement issue for previous PC governments, perhaps the current one, some taxes issue. Give me your sense of what the ballot question the Wild Rose would like to see.
Sure. I think for me, what it would come down to is, do we want a government that we can be proud of again? And yes, this is a by-election. It's not going to change the governing party, but I believe that Wild Rose, through its representatives, through its MLAs, can provide a government that Albertans can be proud of again. And what we've seen from the PCs over the last couple of years, decades even, is that they have lost their way. This is no longer a party that Albertans can look at with pride. And that's why I believe that in these coming by-elections, Albertans are going to send the PCs a very strong message.
Jeff Wilson is the MLA, the Wild Rose MLA for Calgary Shaw. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Still ahead for us, we're going to talk about riding the red